My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. It is Thursday evening. What's the date? The 21st of January, just after 9 p.m. South African time. In Ottawa, Canada, I suspect it's around about 3 p.m. Is that right, Prof. Denis Rancourt?
It's 2 p.m. at the moment.
2 p.m. All right, let me just get this right. So I want to get that French pronunciation correct. Denis Rancourt.
Yeah, that's very good, close. Very good, yeah.
Right. So those.
Yeah, I don't mind when people say Rancourt, but I do prefer the Denis as opposed to Dennis.
Dennis, right. So to those watching, it's Denis. To my fellow South Africans, bring out your French elitism for the next hour and a bit. So you're in Ottawa. Let me. I can't quite remember your full bio, but I've got it here in front of me. I took notes. So I just want to get this right, Denis. You're a former, and I'm going to ask you about that in a second. Former tenured full professor of physics at the University of Ottawa. That means that you can't get fired. Am I correct?
That's what it means when you're tenured, that you can't get fired except with cause. But I was dismissed. There was a huge legal battle in relation to my dismissal, and then we negotiated a global settlement. It took 10 years to settle it.
10 years.
With the help of my union, and it was a huge legal and public relations battle. But it's now completely settled to everyone's satisfaction.
Can I make a terrible joke and say then that you're a former 10-year full professor?
Well, it was actually 2 decades, more than 2 decades. But yeah.
And then I took notes here, and it also says you're a researcher. That's present tense for the Ontario Civil Liberties Association.
Yes.
What is that?
Right. Well, it's a Civil Liberties Association, so it's a volunteer-run organization that fights for and advocates for civil rights in the province of Ontario in Canada. So we do a number of things. We've got a web page, and we explain the various actions that we try and do. We wrote to the World Health Organization in relation to the pandemic. We wrote to the World Health Organization and said, this is crazy, you can't be recommending masks. This is all the science. We reviewed it for them and so on. We wrote to all the government people in Canada, provincial and federal, and said, the government response to this is contrary to science, it's harmful, you have to stop, here are the studies, and so on. We do things like that in terms of the public open letters, and we help individuals and people who are being attacked in various ways.
And then, just to drive home the point that you do know what you're talking about, you've published more than 100 articles in journals. I mean, that is actually quite something. And you've been cited over 5,000 times.
Yes, and one of the characteristics of my research is that it's very interdisciplinary. I have published in journals that deal with vastly different areas of science, everything from biogeochemistry all the way down or up, if you like, to theoretical physics, aspects of theoretical physics. So I ran a big research lab. I was the lab director for over 2 decades, and I was funded nationally and well respected. I've given 40 times I've given keynote or plenary talks at international conferences to scientists. So
good,
I was well recognized in many different areas of science, and I've made some fundamental discoveries and so on. So yeah, that's my background. So and a lot of my background is very specifically relevant to COVID matters.
Yes.
For example, I'm an expert in environmental nanoparticles, and the physics and chemistry and environmental aspects of nanoparticles in the environment. So that's directly related to aerosol particles that can carry viruses, right? I'm an expert in measurement methods, the whole spectrum, the whole suite of various measurement methods, everything from diffraction to various kinds of microscopy, spectroscopy, and so on. And I've taught that at the graduate level in a very popular graduate course that I gave to students from all faculties. So yeah, I've done a lot of things, and a lot of it is let's put it this way, I'm an expert reader of the scientific literature. I know statistics at the highest level. I've used Bayesian inference theory and all kinds of statistical approaches in my research, and so on. So I know when a when scientific authors are stretching the limit of what they can really conclude, or when they're just saying things for the sake of sounding good versus their
Mm.
actual firm results. I can sort all that out. I know what is PR and what is actual firm results that follow from the measurements that were made.
Well, let's just deal with those obvious hater types who bring up the fact that you've had one or two articles retracted.
Well, not retracted. I've had two articles that were deplatformed from ResearchGate, but they were not in peer-reviewed journals. They were just put up there on ResearchGate, right?
Mm.
I've never had one of my journal articles retracted or anything like that. No, but no, there's a lot of deplatforming and censorship going on for sure.
Yes, yes, no, I agree.
And yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that I um, noticed immediately is that you have an affiliation to Panda, which of course is a very good start.
Well, that's a new affiliation for me, and I'm very glad to be part of Panda. Panda is an exciting group. I think they're up to 150 people now, a lot of
Mm.
MDs and scientists and so on, and we discuss science regularly, science and policy and so on in various forums by Zoom. It's very exciting. It's really nice to be able to interact with a rich variety of scientists and medical people. Yeah, I really like it.
So now that we've covered all that stuff, let's get to the
Mm.
real conversation.
Okay.
And one of the okay, look, I have put my neck on the line over the last, let's say, 10 months. South Africa's lockdown came into being towards the end of March, and it pretty much hasn't ended, and I suspect it won't end until probably 2022. I am of the opinion, Denis, that PCR is at the foundation of this entire thing. They keep testing and testing more and testing more. I know about the Corman Drosten review that's been submitted to Eurosurveillance. I don't have high hopes that it's going to get published, mainly because of political lobbying. Um, in your view, just before we actually get to the conversation, where are we at globally?
Oh, globally, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing about this so-called pandemic is it's very different from place to place. Even the death rates that you can look at based on good all-cause mortality data are dramatically different from one small département in France. I know you've been to France. One small region in France. It's not even a region. It's a county. From one county to the next, there's like 50 counties in France. You can go from 0 to 100, if you're on that kind of a scale.
Mm.
And so there are hotspots that are very localized, and then there's nothing. And the same is true of the states in the United States. When I did my study on all-cause mortality, there were more than 30 states that didn't even have a signal. They didn't register deaths in relation to what was happening in the declared pandemic. So it's, to try and generalize globally what's happening, to speak in global terms about where we're at and so on, is very difficult to do. But overall, this has been, in my view, this has been a scam, a lie, a distortion. In my view, we always have viral respiratory diseases, and we always
Mm.
have many of them acting in any season that that together infect many people in the various jurisdictions and so on. Um, that's always there. You see, you hinted at this idea that the start of this was the faulty PCR test.
Mm.
I would put the start of this before that. I would put the start of this when they first were saying that there are strange symptoms we've never seen before. There's a cluster of them, and we ascribe them to this new virus, and they through indirect methods gave a kind of concocted genetic code for that virus. Okay, and they put that out there. It was not peer reviewed at first. It was sent out there, and it's almost like scientists have forgotten how to do proper science, because now all you have to do is say that you've got the full genetic code, put it out there, and
Mm.
the thing exists. Okay, it exists. You've never isolated it, you've never purified it, you've never taken sufficient fluid from an infected person and gone through the process of actually isolating it, so you've got a pure sample that when you put it on the microscope, you see several particles of this one type of virus, and you can tell if it's contaminated with a few other types of viruses and
Mm.
so on. And then you take that purified sample, and from it, on an ab initio basis, do the genetic coding. Okay, all of that has never been done, as far as I can tell, and I keep reading the literature. So we're stuck with this genetic sequencing that is convincing a lot of people that therefore a new virus has been, is out there and is
Yeah.
the thing causing everything. You see, I've argued that any virus or combination of viral respiratory diseases could have done the same thing. You always have sick people in the winter. You see, this is a seasonal mechanism, so there's always a maximum in all-cause mortality in the mid-latitude northern hemisphere. Europe, North America, and so on. You always have this huge seasonal winter peak of all-cause mortality, and then a trough in the summer, and that cycle has existed since we've been measuring it accurately. And you can have extraordinarily high quality data since the Second World War, for example, and you can just see it year after year. Well, the all-cause mortality that is above that summer baseline has not been statistically different in 2020 than it has been for the last 2 decades.
But
Anywhere except in the US, in certain states in the US, where some really unusual things happen, which I think I know what's going on there. But
mm.
in just that exception, you actually have a number of total above baseline deaths that is statistically anomalous. That's statistically higher than you would normally get.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm gonna ask you a little bit about that as we kind of build up a little bit. I just also want to just remind you that I am doing this on a dedicated server. This is not on YouTube. There's no censorship, so you've got nothing to worry about. You don't have to talk in code as people do on YouTube, so that they don't get deplatformed. All
I
right,
don't do that.
fantastic.
I
You're
don't
in the
talk
right
in
place.
code.
Um,
I always say what I want. Yeah.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, okay, and me too. I just want to quickly, before we go on, I want to just quickly ask you a question that I've got in front of me. You were mentioning the variation of numbers from region to region around the world when I asked you sort of for a global outlook. And the question I got here is, how can stats differ so much from one tiny county to another in a single country, if this is a fairly predictable respiratory disease?
Yeah, that's an important question, Jeremy. That you really hit an important point. If you look at all-cause mortality associated with this seasonal cycle, that phenomenon never happens. It never occurs. You can follow it from state to state in the United States over the last many decades, from country to country in Europe, and so on, and you never get these jurisdiction to jurisdiction dramatic differences in the deaths that can be attributed to what's going on in that seasonal uh, stress that's due to viral propagation that occurs in the winter. So this is never before seen with regards to these viral respiratory diseases. Okay, so that is one of the reasons that I have concluded in my research, and I've written 2 big papers about this. The deaths were due to the measures that were imposed. They were due to what was done in a particular jurisdiction as opposed to another, and not due to the normal propagation of a virus in an unperturbed population where you don't have these really stringent measures being
Mm.
applied, and also stringent, or let's say aggressive, reactions to the potential of this new pandemic in terms of treatment in hospitals and so on, right? So it's clear to me. Let me spell out
Mm.
why I
Mm.
believe that the deaths are not normal, that they are induced by the response. These are response induced deaths. Okay, I'm not saying that people didn't die from the virus or a virus or a collection of viruses. I'm saying that the anomalous and well characterized peaks in the all-cause mortality are due to the response, not the underlying virus. Okay, here's the reason. First of all, where these dramatic rises in deaths occurred in the jurisdictions where it occurred, everywhere around the world it occurred synchronously just after the pandemic was announced by the World Health Organization. So there's synchronicity there. You have these a sharp edge of rise in deaths just after the 11th of March 2020. Wherever you're going to get an anomaly, it happens at the same time. And that's just after the World Health Organization said, okay, we've got a pandemic. Now prepare your hospitals because there's a lot of people going to be wanting your hospital services. Well, that's so there's synchronicity, first of all. Secondly, it's it's granular like we've never seen before. There's never been a phenomenon like this in terms of a supposedly fast propagating disease that is dramatically different from one little region to the next, even if they're neighboring regions. Viruses do not normally respect borders or jurisdictions, a government jurisdiction. They just don't. They never have, and you could look at all the data, this never happens. Yeah. So that's a second reason. And the third reason is that in the northern hemisphere, where this sharp edge rise occurred, and I've been studying it in detail, it occurs very late in the cycle of deaths that is associated with this seasonal variation. So there's never been, in all the data I've looked at, there's never been such a late peak in the cycle of all-cause mortality. Okay, those three things together point to what I have proposed is that those deaths cannot have to be due to the measures and what was done in those jurisdictions. And what was done in those jurisdictions, for example, in Canada, 90% of the deaths were in care homes, elderly people in care homes.
New York
and
also.
What they did was
New York also.
Yeah. And so what they did to prepare the hospitals to follow the World Health Organization was to to transfer infected and sick people into these care homes, and at the same time have an imposed lockdown of all these care homes, a very stringent lockdown. So they seeded all the care homes with infections of various kinds, whatever they are. When you're in a hospital and you're in intensive care and so on, you are infected with a number of things, chances are, you know. So they seeded the care homes in this way and then locked them in. Now, locking them in, even from a purely biological point of view, is the worst thing you can do to have an epidemic within the care home, okay? First, because transmission is through aerosol particles and you need ventilation. That's been proven over and over again. The World Health Organization itself has written big reports about the need for ventilation to prevent spread in the built environment and so on. So instead, you close the windows, you close the doors, you don't even have natural ventilation, you lock them in that way. But also, Jeremy, I got to tell you, it's not like science just started in 2020. We've got decades of really good science, you know? And what is known about viral respiratory diseases since decades is that an individual is more likely to be infected when they're exposed and more likely to be very sick from being infected based on two factors that are the dominant factors for relatively young, healthy people. One is the level of psychological stress that the individual is being subjected to in their lives, that they're feeling in their lives, subjected to and felt, okay? And secondly, is the individually as socially isolated. That is a huge factor in how sick you're going to get. No, I'm talking about actually responding to the infection of that virus. How intense the response is the two factors that determine that are psychological stress and social isolation. This is work that's been done for decades by a Professor Cohen in the United States. He spent his career doing this, and these effects are not small. You don't need to tease out something from a randomized controlled trial. His graphs and his results are stunning. Okay, now this was done at a time where you were allowed to infect university students with influenza to do these measurements. Okay, so he would purposefully, with a known strain, infect young adults and see who would get infected from the same infection procedure and how bad the disease would be. And he correlated it in a very strong way to psychological stress and the degree of social isolation of the individual.
That's
Okay?
fantastic, actually, because I've been
Yeah.
wondering about that for months.
Well, it's very important, and it's also, if people are aware of their own bodies and they're living in a place where there is this seasonal cycle
Mm,
of influenza and so on, you notice it for yourself. You're more
mm.
likely to get sick and really sick if it's a stressed period in your life or at work and so on. But anyway, that is a hard science result. This is not a subtlety. It's not something you can argue about. So so, in other words, in terms of the known science and in terms of killing people in care homes, they did the worst possible things. They isolated the elderly, vulnerable people from their families, from their usual routine, from their usual mobility, being able to go outside and so on. They closed them into an environment where you had suspended aerosol particles,
Mm.
and you were not ventilating them. And so this was almost it was a recipe to have epidemics in care homes. That's what it was. What they did, how they responded. So whenever governments say we have to protect the vulnerable, I cringe, because
Yes.
I know what they're thinking of is locking down these institutions and creating the conditions where you're going to kill as many as you can, in a sense. So I cringe when they say we have to protect the vulnerable. In fact, Sweden is a
Mm.
country that didn't have overall lockdowns, and but they did lock down their care homes. They did want to protect the elderly. Well, Sweden had a large peak of deaths in care homes, even though you see what I'm saying.
Mm.
And so how you treat the vulnerable, because they're the ones most likely to die from these infections. Exactly what you do to them is vital. It's crucial. And the thing you don't want to do is protect them with special unproven methods like locking them into the homes and things like that.
Well, I mean, talking about unproven and, of course, science, I don't know if you are aware, but if you aren't aware, the hair on your arms is going to stand up right now. But in South Africa, we are prohibited from going to the beach. Anywhere in the country, we are prohibited from going to the beach because apparently going to the beach, Denis, is what they call a super spreader event. Do you have that term where you are?
Of course, um, that's insane. It's contrary to science. Okay, especially at a beach, you're going to have you normally have air movement. Okay, because of the difference in temperature between the water mass and the land mass and so on. You've got wind. It's flat usually, so you've got wind there. There is no way that an outside beach environment can be a place that you can consider to be one where transmission will occur. That is completely contrary to science. It's insane. Okay. Uh, it doesn't even matter if you're close together. I mean, I don't know what you would have to do to have transmission events at a beach, in a beach environment. I don't want to
Yes.
think about it. It
Well,
might be
please
obscene.
don't judge
But
me. Please don't judge me. I didn't make that stupid rule.
oh no, I'm not judging you. I'm not judging you. I'm responding to what your government did. It is the whole thing about, okay, look, transmission occurs in the built environment for these viral respiratory diseases. Period. Period. People have to understand that. There is study after study of showing that transmission occurs in the built environment. This daycare center, you measure the density of aerosol particles that are laden with viruses, and you notice that many of the kids caught the thing and so on. This has been done over and over again. Airplanes, where you have circulating air in the airplane, but the air is not ventilated out, and you know that one person's infected, and within a week or so, you follow them, and everyone or a lot of the people that were on that airplane are infected. So we know there are many, many scientific articles about how transmission occurs. This is one. It's just so crazy because you have to understand, with viral respiratory diseases, it's not like we started studying it this year. We have known for a long time why you have this seasonal effect in mid latitude countries. It's because
Mm.
aerosol particles are only stable in air when the absolute humidity is low, which is the winter. Okay. And that would be the winter in the southern hemisphere as
Yeah.
well. So it would be our summer, you see. And this is all been studied, it's been documented. And measurements of how stable actual aerosol particles are depending on humidity of air have been done in the laboratory.
Mm.
In the 70s they were doing this. This is it's really well on a lot of this stuff is really well understood, and the great variety of viruses that propagate this type of disease, always with very similar symptoms. Basically, the virus through aerosol particles comes into your lungs through the air, starts infecting the surfaces of your lungs. You get sick, you fight it off, you have symptoms that are related to an infection in your lungs. This has been happening forever.
Mm.
Viruses have co-evolved with breathing animals since there were breathing animals. There were viruses around before there were breathing animals. They've been around, as far as we can tell, from the very first living cells that appeared on the
Mm.
planet. There were viruses that co-evolved with them. So these things there's a great variety of them, and they've evolved to persistently be there.
Mm.
And if they were killing the hosts, they would die out themselves, right?
Yeah, I'm going to come to that in a second. But you mentioned humidity, and I've got a question here for you from a viewer. You're saying, look, Prof, you initially claimed a second wave would be due to changes in humidity. Have you updated that opinion in light of recent spreads?
Okay, so what I have said is there won't be a second wave, there'll be a 1,000th wave. Okay? In other words, there are increases in all-cause mortality every winter in places where we talk about these diseases. Okay? And there's always mutations, there's always a variety of viruses that are acting in the community, in the population. And so there's always going to be a peak in mortality like that. So that's what I've said. Now, I think the person asking the question may be referring to surges in all-cause mortality that are not related to the winter season. For example, in the United States, there was a huge hump right in midsummer. Crazy stuff that's never been seen before. Okay, the only time that I know of in the data where there has been a peak in midsummer in all-cause mortality is one time in Europe and France, where there was a heat wave, a terrible heat wave in August 2003, and it caused a sharp peak and killed some 10,000 people in France. Otherwise, you never get that, which is why I have said, and we're back to what I originally said at the beginning of the interview, these anomalous peaks, which are only occurring in the United States, where we have good data, have to be due to the measures. These are
Yes.
deaths associated with everything that was done and so on, right?
Do you think, Prof, that that's related to why we in South Africa, which is currently midsummer, we're sitting with a peak? We're sitting with a lot of full hospitals right now. If you look at our media, it's a catastrophe. It's almost worse than what it was
well,
6 months ago.
You're judging how filled the hospitals are by looking at your media, as you say. That's the first thing. That's one of the problems here. It's very hard to get good data, to get objective, proper, quantitative, unbiased data.
But
is
deaths are
almost
deaths,
impossible.
surely.
Yeah, a death is a death, but a hospital bed is a hospital bed also. But you've got to go and see the hospital beds. You've got to register the death. If you want good data, you have to actually go out into the field and do these things. So you can't just interview the head of a hospital who says, "Oh my God, we're overloaded this year," and the journalist doesn't think to ask them, "Well, what was it like last year, or what was it like for the last 10 years, or and so on." So it's very hard to get good data. But hospitals, at least in the northern in Canada, let's say, hospitals are always overburdened in the winter. All-cause mortality is higher in the winter, and this is true of heart conditions, bacterial pneumonia, and viral respiratory diseases. Those are the three that are normally go together and cause that big peak in the winter. So there are often times where hospitals are overburdened. Yeah.
But something weird is happening at the moment. I mean, we don't normally have all this kind of activity going on in the hospitals midsummer towards the end of January here in South Africa. I mean, I can tell
Okay,
you,
there are two things, Jeremy. There are two things. Okay. First, you have to be sure that the activity you're talking about is actually documented, that there are actual investigative journalists went on site and they actually verified this, and you can get good data. You can talk about specific hospitals where this is happening and show evidence of lineups and people lying around in the hallways and so on. First, you have to have good data. And then secondly, you have to say, well, is this normal or not? Is it anomalous for this time of the year? And then thirdly, if it's anomalous, what's it due to? And it's not because everyone's wearing their COVID glasses that it's necessarily due to a virus.
Sure,
okay?
yes.
So here we're in a situation, I don't know how bad it is in South Africa, but in the United States, they have dramatically perturbed the society, the structures, the support networks. People have lost their jobs, their livelihood. They've been socially isolated like never before. They're having to self-medicate, they're drinking more, there's more depression, there's all kinds of horrible things that are a consequence of telling people you cannot go out, you only essential services are allowed to have, to work, you can't travel, you have to be afraid of everyone and stay socially distanced, this 2-meter rule and so on. It's crazy the extent to which they have perturbed our lives and our livelihoods and the things that we normally do and that we normally consider to be normal. So given all of that, who are the people that are likely to be harmed enough to want to go to the hospital? That's what you have to ask. You'd have to go in and say, who's in the hospital? Why are they there? How did they get here? What's their story? You'd have to do field work. You'd have to, if there really are more, and how different are they and so on.
And I mean,
but I can tell you one thing, they're not doing investigative work right now. There's no, they're not doing autopsies. They're not doing forensic analysis, of anything. All they do is they use a faulty PCR test and confirm that, according to this test, COVID is present, and therefore we'll tick that box, and that's all there is to it. This is a COVID phenomenon. Everyone's wearing those glasses. Right. Everyone's doing that. Everyone within the institutions is rewarded for having that behavior, as opposed to trying to figure out what's really going on.
You were saying now that it's created some psychological problems, and I honestly think that is a major variable. It's a difficult one to prove, because a friend of mine who's an anaesthetist at one of the largest hospitals in Johannesburg, he says that the hospital is full, but it's not catastrophic. It's normally full. ICUs tend to operate at 80% capacity always, otherwise they go into too much debt. But he also says that there's a problem with critical care and ventilation, and people are panicking and they don't know what they're doing, and they're putting people onto oxygen too quickly and using too much. Are you aware of anything like that?
Oh, well, it's proven. There was a very strong and important scientific article that showed that these ventilators killed people. Pure and simple. You put them on ventilators and you kill them. They would not have died if you hadn't done that. There was a large study published in the scientific journals that showed that for New York, the state of New York. So there's no question in my mind that part of this peak that I said was due to the measures is in part due to the treatment, because treatments were very aggressive. MDs and treating physicians feel that they have carte blanche. They feel they can do anything because a pandemic's been declared. It's been declared to be something virulent and special and so on, and therefore they can throw everything they can think of at you to try and save you. So a lot of that would have caused deaths, in my opinion. But Jeremy, you said stress is maybe a big factor. I want to remind your listeners about some science. This is not controversial stuff. This is extremely well established science. Do you know what the single biggest indicator factor that co-associates with an individual's health is, according to many animal and human studies? Everybody is now recognizing this. the biggest factor, the determinant, if you like, is where you stand in terms of being subjected to hierarchical dominance stress. Okay,
Sure.
we are social animals. We live in a dominance hierarchy. They've done this with monkeys, all kinds of social animals. And the biggest predictor of whether the animal will be mostly sickly, spend a lot of their time in not great health, and die sooner than the others is the extent to which they're being subjected to this hierarchical stress. In other words, they're low in that hierarchy, and they're being put in their place constantly.
Mm.
And in a random fashion, they're being aggressed just to remind them who the boss is, and so on. That is the biggest predictor of social animals in terms of your
Mm.
health. That's the number one thing. Okay. So we have to keep that in mind. We also have to keep in mind another important proven fact, at least in Western countries, developed countries where these studies have been done. The third causal factor of death is medicine itself. That's huge,
Sure.
right? You've got cancer, you've got heart disease, and then you've got medicine. And a lot of people argue that medicine is maybe second because it depends how you count and what you mean by that. But clearly, the complications that come from prescription drugs, their combination, their bad prescription, their overprescription, there is a huge killer. Huge. So with that context in mind, where there have now been dozens of studies, there are entire journals about how medicine causes death.
Wow.
Okay, it's now an area of study, and there have been many, many reviews that demonstrate the degree to which 400,000 deaths every year in the United States, for example, okay, are caused by medicine, the medical establishment, what it does to people. So that is the context. Now, in that context, it's not hard to imagine that when you declare a pandemic and everyone's running around like crazy, uh, uh, um, clinicians are going to do things that could cause death. Okay, and it's been proven now. So that's the context that we always have to put it in the broad context of what we know about the system, what we know about human societies, and what we know about the disease itself. And that's the context that I try to use in my analysis.
But the question that keeps coming up, Denis, is okay, so all these people are dying. Somebody knows somebody who's died of COVID, but now it's changed to COVID related. What is going on? Flu seems to have disappeared. It almost seems like it's. Ooh, I've got to be careful here. I don't want to say a hoax, but it almost seems that way.
Everything that seems is what you're seeing through the media and what they're telling you. That's important, you know. It's important to really keep that in mind. In fact, we even judge how effective our own actions are, our political actions. We incorrectly judge that based on what we see in the mainstream media. You cannot judge if you're politically trying to get people to be more rational about COVID, and you're talking to people and you're doing interviews and you're doing all kinds of things. You cannot do that and judge how effective your action is by looking at the mainstream media. That's insane, because that's not where you're going to see your result. They're not going to tell you that you're succeeding. You have to use different measures than that. You have to look at the feedback you're getting, how many people are responding, who's responding, when are they responding, and so on. You have to do your own measure of the impact of your efforts. And the same is true about any aspect. When you're trying to perceive what the world is, you cannot just listen to the media. You cannot use that as a reference point even. All you can tell from listening to the mainstream media is that this is what they want you to believe. That's all you can tell. So it's a very good information source about what they want you to believe, but it's completely unreliable in other regards.
Let me come back then to some questions that people ask, and we don't have to spend too much time on it because this kind of thing comes up all the time, but I just want to get your view so that it can lay a premise for what comes after that. But okay, number one, does SARS-CoV-2 exist? Because you said it hasn't been isolated. So is the virus real? Let's start there.
Well, here's the answer I would give to that. And I've given this in writing in various articles. I say it doesn't matter. It's not an important question, because any virus or combination of viruses could have done the same thing. You have a suite of symptoms. People, you have these virologists that want to make a great career move by identifying a new pathogen that causes supposedly a new disease, which has an array of symptoms very similar to things we see all the time, especially if you're in a hospital where the sickest people go and run to. And you use very novel and indirect methods to characterize it. You're not using rigorous scientific methods where I don't want to talk about the separation technology and everything, but the point is any virus could do, because you're going to have this winter cycle of all-cause mortality. The media is causing everyone to wear these COVID glasses. You've got a faulty PCR test that does not detect whether or not the person is infected with a virus that the person's actively fighting in their bodies right now. It doesn't tell you anything about that. I could tell you more about the PCR,
yes,
and what it does tell you and what it doesn't tell you, but that's part of the glasses that you're wearing. So in the end, you could do that sequence of things hand in hand with the propaganda. I would argue that the PCR technology that was developed is part of the propaganda. Okay, and if you did that, you could have done it with any viral respiratory disease or combination, not even have to identify them, and you would get all the same results. If you locked people down and made them destroyed their lives in the way that you did, you would get the extra deaths in the United States any year. You don't need a special virus for that. You don't need a particular strain that you know the genetic code for, or anything like that. You don't need that. So my answer to the question is, it doesn't matter.
Right.
It doesn't really, there's no point arguing about it.
Sure. Okay. But then, Prof, by extension, does it cause COVID? And again, by further extension, what is COVID?
This is all part of the narrative that was constructed, right? COVID-19 is a suite of symptoms which are not unique. They just put some symptoms together. They said, we'll call this condition COVID-19, that is tied to and associated with this new virus that we'll call SARS-CoV-2, that no one's ever identified, but we think we have a genetic sequence for it. Since we have a genetic sequence for it, this is interesting, Jeremy, all you've got is a genetic sequence on paper. And on that basis, you can do a lot. You can design a PCR test using part of that, certain genes as targets, and say, well, if I detect a piece that's like this, then I'll say that I have this particular virus. Okay, you can do that without ever having the virus. In fact, the Corman's article that developed the PCR test, they admit it up front. We don't have an isolate. We don't have a sample. Samples don't exist of this virus. So we have to work from the genetic sequence that's been provided. And here's what we did. And here's how we did it. So you're detecting a piece of a genetic sequence on something. And you're saying, therefore, I've got a live virus. So once you have that genetic sequence on paper, you can do wonderful things. You can make a completely faulty PCR test that then becomes the norm for detecting this thing. But also, importantly, if you have only a sequence on paper, you can design a messenger RNA vaccine. You don't ever have to know or have the pathogen or be able to reproduce it in a lab. You can make the messenger RNA and a vaccine, okay?
And
without having anything other than just knowing what the genetic sequence is. That's important, because with a traditional vaccine, you have to isolate the pathogen, and you have to make a lot of it. You have to culture the pathogen in order to then kill it and use it in your vaccine, or weaken it somehow, or make a weakened version of it and reproduce it. You have to have live cell cultures or live animals or live organs in order to culture the pathogen in order to then purify it and use it to make this vaccine. That's a traditional route. You don't have to do any of that if you're going to use this novel technology that's never been widely used to vaccinate people, which is this mRNA, messenger RNA vaccine. You don't need any of that. You don't need to. So you're simplifying the manufacturing process. You're never going to have to use live cultures, live animals, or anything like that. You're making a pure product, a messenger RNA, in a laboratory synthesis. You don't have all that messy organisms around. It's cheaper, easier to control the quality, and then you have to argue that this technology actually works. You have to say, you have to try to argue from the literature that if you send strands of mRNA into the body, they will properly go into cells and then reproduce, eventually come out of the cells, and your immune system will recognize them, and so on and so on. You have to follow the narrative, but the problem is naked mRNA gets attacked by the body's defenses right away because it shouldn't be in your body, and those particular ones. So it gets taken out. It has a very small lifetime. So you have to encapsulate it in something. So you encapsulate it in this lipid thing. The problem is most of these lipids themselves are toxic, and the body responds to them, and so on. And so you develop this technology with a narrative of how it works, and you can do all that because you're backed by these tentative laboratory experiments on messenger RNA, and you can produce a vaccine without ever having the pathogen in hand.
But that doesn't sound like good science, and I'm not a scientist.
There's an understatement. It's not. It's good business, is what it is. Okay, it's meant to be good business. It's not. This is the opposite of a rational world where you do things for the good of people and humanity. It's
So
the opposite of that.
hold on. So, Prof, are you saying then that this vaccine is nonsense?
I'm saying that it probably is. In my view, having read what I read, knowing now what I know about how these, mRNA vaccine, in quotation, technology has been around for about a decade. They've been testing it and developing it and inventing it and telling the narrative about it. But what I read in that literature does not convince me at all that you could make an effective vaccine by this technology. It doesn't convince me at all. You get an immune response. Well, you're going to get an immune response when you put something in the body. You put almost anything, you're going to get an immune response. Is it an immune response that actually protects you from the next time you get this or a similar virus? That's the question. Is it effective? You don't even know what your if you wanted to, it's just crazy. Even if you wanted to test it on animals, you don't even have a pure, they're using mixed samples of a bunch of viruses that caused another animal to be sick, and they're hoping that the virus of interest is in there, and they're using that to infect after they've vaccinated. I mean, this is all very, this is not, high tech in the sense of being exact and precise. This is wet chemistry. It's messy. It involves living organisms. It involves trying to interpret the results that are not cut and dry in themselves. How was the organ attacked? Which organ was attacked? To which degree was it attacked? And down to the so this is very tenuous stuff. They like to package it nicely, put it in a nice bottle, give it nice names, draw nice pictures when they tell the narrative of how this thing works. But in reality, this is messy stuff, really messy stuff.
And it's bad science.
Well, it's worse than bad science, because this particular vaccine, the only thing they've tested so far is, to some degree, whether it's lethal. Will it kill a lot of people in the trials? Okay. They're admitting that it's not particularly effective at preventing you from being reinfected, and they haven't demonstrated that it is. But they have taken young, healthy adults and demonstrated that relatively few of them get very sick. and only I think it was 2 of them that died in the first trial or something. Now, here's the problem, Jeremy. An elderly person is so different in
Mm.
terms of their metabolism and their bodies from a young, healthy person that it's almost a different species. I mean, the flora in your gut is different, which informs your brain differently. You know, there's a lot of science on how different the bodies of elderly people are compared to young, healthy people. All right. So they have not tested for safety this vaccine on elderly people whatsoever. And yet they are in priority in many countries giving the vaccine to elderly people under the pretext that they're the most vulnerable and that they therefore need to be most protected. So what this means is that a trial is being done using a substance that has never been tested on a safety for the relevant population, and they're giving it to that population, which in addition is the most frail population in the society. So that is unethical. That is contrary to all of medical
Mm.
ethics since the Nuremberg Code was developed. It's absolutely at odds with that. You cannot large scale do an experiment on a human population without ever even having tested for safety. And that is in effect what is being done because it's never been tested on elderly people.
And then
And,
what
and in addition, I would add one more
mm.
thing. That also means that since the safety testing has not been done, it means that the elderly person that you're proposing this vaccine to, it is impossible for them to give informed consent,
Right.
which is which is section 2 of the Nuremberg Code. Okay, you have to give informed consent. You cannot give informed consent if there is no relevant information about the safety of this thing. It is impossible, therefore, to give informed consent. The person injecting you doesn't even know how dangerous it is,
Mm.
so they can't properly inform you. So you're violating the foundation of medical ethics by putting this vaccine out in a rush circumstances and saying, well, it'll be perfect. We'll just document how many people die. You know, in fact, in Israel,
Yeah, I saw that.
um, yeah, in Israel they have there's actually a ministry group that well, a
Mm.
group that informed that directly is with the health ministry that said we're going to say that this is experimentation on humans,
Mm.
uh, and that therefore you needed pre-approval, and pre-approval presupposes that you have to do the relevant safety trials. Okay, there, and so that was a big hoopla in the Israeli media, and no other mainstream media talked about it around the world in the West for some reason.
And it's kind of
Yeah.
weird though because nobody can sue the pharmaceutical companies that are pushing out this
Well,
experiment.
in the normal society, before they started changing the laws to protect big pharma,
Mm.
you could sue them. Of course, you could, and you should be able to in a society that protects individuals and protects itself from being degraded in this way. But you're right. Many governments have made these kind of no-fault rules and have said, well, there'll be an administrative tribunal that'll look at your claim, that'll evaluate it, and the government will compensate you. That
Yeah.
is now the norm for vaccines in the U.S., for example. And so these laws are being passed more and more. So that means that you detach the perpetrator from the consequences of what they
Mm.
did.
Mm.
The other huge thing is that the trials themselves are funded, run, controlled, and communicated by big pharma, by the manufacturer that's going to profit from this. That's incredible. Think about it. Never before in modern societies since the Second World War have we allowed it's societies have degraded to the point where we now find this to be normal, that a government agency which has improper ties to big pharma itself in terms of uh, uh, rotating employees and funding and everything, that the government agency is receiving information that big pharma wants to give it, that it decides it's going to give it. Sure, there's a legal obligation that they have to divulge what they did and what the dangers are, but in actual fact, in practice, they make up the spreadsheet, they write the report, they choose um, to. Okay, they're making billions of dollars. Is there any chance that they're going to falsify one of these reports? Is there any chance? Is there any probability? Ask yourself.
Mm.
You know, people's careers, all these employees, the executives that are going to get bonuses, the huge amount of money that's involved, and they're supported by the entire system. Is there any chance that when they communicate safety information to the FDA, that maybe there'll be some bias, that maybe there'll be some faulty information or omissions? Sure, they'll have good reasons for the omissions, but is it possible that that'll
Um,
happen?
just to confirm what you're saying, I saw a
Yeah.
graph about maybe a month or two ago that showed the amount of spending by the largest lobby groups in the United States, and by more than double, the number one biggest spender or the biggest lobbyist is Big Pharma.
Yeah, big pharma is huge,
Mm,
and so is agri-food.
yeah.
Genetically modified crops and all of the specialized products that you sell with them. Uh, Glyphosate. No one's talking about glyphosate. Glyphosate has the mass use of glyphosate has huge health repercussions that are proven in the scientific literature, cause all kinds of gut diseases that we've never seen before, and so on. Um, so this is the world we live in. This is the institutions have been captured. They are corrupt. There
Mm-hmm.
is no longer professional independence. That's one of the really great things about the COVID-19 episode, is that they've dramatically perturbed society. They've made us very uncomfortable. They've made us suffer. And as a result, people are trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
Yeah.
And people are, for the first time, noticing that the medical establishment is corrupt. I mean, you have an editorial in a leading medical journal where
The
the
Lancet.
editor says,
The Lancet.
talks about scientific corruption. Okay, it's incredible. So this massive aggression against society that's been perpetrated
Mm,
has caused us to become aware of the degree of corruption and the degree of capture of our institutions and the lack of democracy in our countries. The other positive thing is that ordinary people are wanting to learn and are learning a lot and are asking a lot of questions. You know,
mm,
I'll put a scientific article on Twitter and I get all kinds of ordinary people making comments, going in, reading the article, pulling out extracts, asking
mm.
what this means. Uh, um, I had one person just today say, "Is there a place where we can take a course on how to read these scientific articles? How to figure this out? Because it's really complicated." And people are actually interested, and they're using their common sense. They're
Mm.
acquiring huge amounts of knowledge, and often good, solid knowledge. Regular people are doing this more and more. I mean, it's being very educational for a large part of people. There's also the phenomenon of spinning out into extreme, theories about what's
Mm.
going on. That can happen, and it's normal. You're trying to figure things out. You see all these unexplained aggressions against you and your family and your society, and you're
Mm.
trying to figure out what could possibly be happening. So it's normal to project dangers. Any animal would do that. Monkeys see a shadow and they think it's a lion. They run for the trees.
Exactly. Prof,
Yeah,
I've got a bunch of questions from my viewers, and but I don't want to break the flow just yet. Um, so I'll get to the questions just now, if you don't mind. Sorry,
sure.
by the I see that I just look at my time here, and I see that we've reached about an hour. Do you mind hanging around a bit longer?
We can go longer.
Ah, fantastic,
I'm
great
here.
stuff.
Let's do it. Yeah,
Great,
yeah.
thank you. Okay, you were just talking about. Well, I mean, okay, it doesn't really matter because it's all linked. But one of the things I've been trying to find a way in is I wanted you to tell me a little bit about your understanding of masks, because this is a massive problem, and it's not a problem that's just here in South Africa. It's global, and it goes beyond and again, I've got to re-emphasize this. I'm not a scientist, okay, but I have read a lot over the last 10 months, more than I probably ever would have in my life were it not for this so-called pandemic. But the one thing I have learned is that masks, and correct me if I'm wrong, masks have very little impact on viruses. And when I say masks, I'm talking about a scarf, a buff, a surgical mask, and even an N95. Tell me a bit more, and put me in my place if I've
Oh,
got it
well,
wrong.
listen, I've written several major articles about this. The way that I sort of broke into this area of COVID was my first article on masks that was deplatformed from ResearchGate. The title actually was "Masks Don't Work: A Review of Science Relevant to the Policy of COVID-19." And the ResearchGate people freaked out. Anyway, all it was a review of the scientific literature. Okay, listen, Jeremy, here it is. It's really simple. In medicine, you have things you want to do to people, treatments of some kind or another. It can be a vaccination, it can be wearing a mask, it can be an operation, it can be whatever, okay? The problem in medical science is that when you do these treatments, different individuals respond in dramatically different ways to the treatment. The person-to-person differences are large compared to the benefit of the treatment. Okay, that's the key. So because of that, medical science has developed a very good protocol to address that difficulty when they're trying to figure out if a treatment is good or not. They do what's called a randomized control trial. A randomized control trial means that you have a control group or a placebo group, if you want to call it that, and the group that you apply the treatment to. And you choose the individuals for this group at random, so that you're not selecting only the sick people to be treated, or only the sick people not to be treated, or only the even things like, for example, it's known that certain Asian groups respond very violently and are more often allergic to certain chemo treatments. So you have to randomize. You have to take a large enough group and randomize so that your control group is similar enough and large enough to, and then you look for differences, average differences of the treatment control versus the group that you apply the treatment to. That's the gold standard for figuring out if a treatment is effective.
Yes.
That's the only thing you can do in a situation where the benefit is small or comparable to the individual to individual differences. Okay? So
Right.
in this area of science, you need to do randomized controlled trials. Well, there have been several large randomized controlled trials to figure out if masks are of any benefit in terms of reducing the risk of transmission of a viral respiratory disease. There have been 15 policy grade such studies where, in addition, they do what's called verified outcome, which means they analyze if you actually were infected by the virus by a lab measurement. They don't just rely on the anecdotes of, yes, you were coughing more yesterday and that kind of thing, and ask you by phone. Some studies do that. But if you take just the quality studies where you remove all the bias by doing it properly this way, there have been 15 large studies in many different environments, in homes, in healthcare facilities, in the general population now recently in Denmark. All of them all give the same result. We cannot detect a benefit in terms of reducing the risk of being infected.
What kind of mask?
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, they do all kinds of masks. There have been these there's a class of these measurements that compare the N95 mask to the regular surgical masks, and they all find no difference between the two. That should tell you something already.
Sure.
There's no difference in terms of protecting you from this virus between those two types of masks. So if you look at, but generally the great majority of these studies, it's surgical masks. Okay, so they actually were distributing surgical masks to the people in that branch of the trial. So this means, Jeremy, that the benefit is too small to be detected by science. It's not statistically meaningful. The
Sure.
only thing that comes out in some of the trials that is statistically meaningful, for example, is that some of the healthcare workers that were wearing N95 masks got a lot of headaches, way more than the people that weren't wearing them all the time. So there are things you can see like that are statistically significant. But in terms of protecting you from the viral respiratory disease, it is the benefit cannot be detected. Now, what that means is that science has spoken. Masks do not work, period. It doesn't matter what you believe about the mechanism of transmission. It doesn't matter what you imagine the droplets or the cough balls or whatever you want to think of are doing. It doesn't matter that a piece of cloth can filter out droplets when you cough into it. None of that matters. You do a proper randomized control trial. You do, it's 15 of them now that have been done, that have been reviewed and looked at again and again, and they all have the same conclusion. We cannot statistically see a significant difference. This means the difference is too small to be detected by an experiment designed to detect the effect. Good God. So to say anything else now, and you see, that's the problem, is that governments have reversed this principle of the precautionary principle. Okay, they've reversed it. The government is supposed to, in a potentially dangerous treatment, such as preventing people from breathing, causing them to put humidity on a cloth, and therefore there's this bacterial perfect medium for bacteria to grow. There's all kinds of potential dangers. With any potentially dangerous thing that the government wants to do, they have the onus to show that it's not dangerous. That's what the precautionary principle is. They're supposed to do this before they apply the measure. And they have reversed it. They're applying the measure and then asking whether or not scientists could demonstrate that they were right to do that. It's an upside down world. So
it's all backwards, yeah.
All backwards. It's all backwards. And so masks, the mask question is answered by randomized controlled trials. That's all there is to it. Now, knowing that masks don't work, you can ask, why is it mechanistically? As a scientist, what do you think? And I can tell you, as a scientist, that I am convinced that the main transmission route is fine aerosol particles that are part of the fluid air. If you have, a cloud of fine aerosol particles in the room that you're in or wherever, and you're wearing a mask and you're breathing with that mask, there are low impedance routes around the mask everywhere, through the biggest pores in the mask and so on, where the air will get in, otherwise you can't breathe. And these very minute particles are part of that air, and they're going to go straight into your lungs, period. That's all there is to it. Now, in addition to that, it takes very few of these virus-laden particles to infect you. The so-called minimal infectious dose is very, very low with these types of diseases, the viral respiratory diseases. So it doesn't matter, even if you could filter out, let's say 90% of the aerosol particles, even if you could, hypothetically, 10% of them is 100 times more than you need to infect the person. Okay, and every time you breathe, you're breathing in 10% of them. So you can discuss things in terms of the mechanisms after you know and postulate what's going on and why it doesn't work. But the first thing is to determine, is there a benefit? And the only scientific way to do that is the randomized control trial. Does that help?
Yeah, well, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
In actual fact, it's brilliant. I'm gonna chop that bit out and put that onto Twitter.
Great.
It's a wonderful soundbite. Okay, I need to get to some of the viewer questions, otherwise I'm going to be ignoring them, and I don't want to do that because they make the show happen, Prof.
Absolutely.
I apologize for the random nature of the questions, but that's just the way it is. No. All right. So,
random's better.
All right. So this question says, but the symptoms vary so widely. Is it correct to still call this a respiratory viral infection?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. Yes, sick people have very different symptoms from one person to the next. But they're also affected by many different pathogens and conditions, right? You never just die of a viral respiratory disease. Every time this has been looked at, They analyze the fluids and they find several viruses being co-multiplied in the infected person's body.
Mm.
Okay, typically two, three, four, five of just the ones they're able to detect. And in addition to that, what generally kills you is not. See, the thing is, uh, bacterial pneumonia cooperates with viral infections.
Yes.
So you're going to get a lot of people dying from bacterial pneumonia that were first infected with this viral infection. Also, whenever a viral infection um, demands metabolic energy from you because your immune system has to kick in and do all this work and all these things, it removes metabolic energy from the other things that your body's doing to
Mm.
keep you alive. And in someone that already has another medical condition, is already fighting other things, that puts them near the edge of death. And there can be this nonlinear reaction where they do die. So whenever you stress the metabolism of a person that is already sick with one or more several conditions, that's when people die.
Right.
The, gen-
And
the average person who gets a viral respiratory diseases virtually never dies. You
mm,
recover from it. Your immune system has learned to handle this, and if it hasn't learned well enough, you're going to get more sick than you would otherwise, but you're going to learn in this cycle you're going to learn.
mm,
Okay? So what matters in terms of your symptoms is what conditions do you have already? What is the history of challenges of various infections to you personally? What is your immunological history? Have you been infected by something similar enough that your immune system already has an edge in terms of recognizing this thing? All these things matter, and every person's body is different. So someone is going, given the same. When Cohen was doing these studies, actually infecting university students with a known influenza strain, okay, different students would have very different reactions. Some people would complain about these terrible headaches. Some people would have a stomach flu. Some people,
mm.
b- bodies respond differently to the same thing also. And as I said, in his studies, the amount of that was very, very tied to the amount of psychological stress they were being subjected to.
In
So I,
reference,
I
sorry, go on.
yeah, yeah. Oh, Cohen's work, he even wrote a review article of all this that's relevant to COVID-19 this year, like 2020. His work is easy to find. Just look at stress, disease and stress. Do a Google, disease and stress, Cohen. You'll find it all right away. Yeah.
In reference to the bacterial comment you made, the bacterial pneumonia comment, Satan himself, I mean, sorry, Fauci himself, um, actually did a study, what, about a decade ago, in which he looked at 1918 and Hong Kong and a bunch of other
Yes, I know.
pandemics,
Yeah.
in which he found that bacterial pneumonia was the leading cause of death.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah,
make
that's
of that
right. There's a
study?
major paper. Absolutely, it's a great study. If it's the same one I'm thinking of, they went in and because they preserved the microscopy slides
Mm,
of these, of the taken from the lungs of these people who died. They actually did a lot of autopsies and they did a lot of research to try to figure out what had happened. And when you review those slides, what you find is lungs that are attacked by bacteria in virtually, in the great majority of cases. So basically, that means everyone died from bacterial pneumonia. So this was before
but
there were really good antibiotics,
okay, but so
before
my
there was.
wife said to me a few days ago, she said, yes, but pneumonia is often a result of a respiratory disease, so this isn't anything breakthrough, or is it?
Is what a breakthrough?
No, I mean,
I mean, it's interesting that you have this narrative that a particular strain of a viral respiratory disease is what caused this 1919 epidemic
well,
that
we
was a
know that they wore
pandemic.
masks. We know that they wore masks in 1918 in the
Yeah,
US.
yeah. But there's this narrative by virologists that's saying, oh my God, it's the particular strain of a particular virus that can do this, and we have to
Mm.
define what a pandemic is and so on. But then you have this other study that says, well, actually, everybody that died was, really infected by bacterial pneumonia. Okay, so where's your virus? How is it that you're saying the virus caused this?
Oh,
The other thing
right.
you have to understand, huh? And the
Yeah,
other
yeah.
thing you have to understand is that deaths during these winter cycles of viral respiratory disease, deaths are very, very dependent on the health status of the population. So when you look at the data, and this is in my papers, when you look at these oscillations, these winter oscillations since the Second World War, the magnitude of the peak of the all-cause mortality peak is very high initially, right after the war, and gradually decreases until it gets to kind of like the modern value around in the 1970s, and it hasn't really budged since then.
Mm.
So you always have a peak of about the same magnitude since then. And the last integrated peak in terms of total excess above the summer baseline is the same. For example, in the entire France, it's the same statistically as it's been for the last 2 decades. And this is true of Europe, all countries. The only place that you have something really, even for the United States, if you take just the first peak without getting into the summer and all the crazy stuff that happened due to the measures, even that peak, even that sharp
Mm.
COVID peak initially in March and April, integrated does not give you an anomaly, a statistical anomaly in terms of numbers. Okay, so this is what's happening.
Let me read you some more questions, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
yeah,
And just, I just wanted to say earlier to you, which I forgot, you were talking about the vaccine probably being unnecessary. Well, I remember reading about 2 or 3 months ago the world's most cited infectious disease specialist, Professor Didier Raoul in France, and he himself said that it's probably a waste of time to even bother making a vaccine.
yeah. Well, he is, whatever you want to say about him. One thing you have to admit is that he's an independent thinker.
Mm.
He has real professional independence.
I
He
think
will
he's
actually say
fantastic.
what he really thinks. I
He,
think so too. He will say what he actually thinks, and he
yes.
also thinks a lot about things and has a breadth of knowledge. And so I would trust an expert like that to give me some insights on what's really
Yes.
going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Interesting question. Do you think it's possible for radio waves to alter cells? Oh, I know where that's heading. I know that there's a bit of a conspiratorial undertone there, but okay. So answer the question. Nevertheless, do you think it's possible for radio waves to alter cells?
Yeah, this is tied to that whole G5 thing, right?
5G, yes.
Um, yeah,
I'm
5G. Yeah.
guessing. I'm guessing, yes.
Yeah, I would guess that too. Okay, listen. There's two things here. First, it is true that electromagnetic waves affect live tissue and live organisms and live beings and so on. Of course, that's true. Electromagnetic waves includes visible light, ultraviolet
Mm.
light, infrared light, radio waves. They will affect you because you are made of matter. There are electrons in there, charged particles. There's all kinds of things. Microwaves affect matter
Mm.
and can cause molecules to vibrate and so generally speaking, no one's going to contest that the various waves that are around us because of all the technology does affect us in a sense that there has to be a physical response. You're absorbing this
Yeah.
radiation, but the question is, does it have a does it cause a physiological condition? Does it cause a biological condition that you can measure, that is big enough that you can detect and really ascribe to that? And so I reviewed the 5G literature, all the people that have looked into that, but I limited myself to scientific articles only, and I concluded that there was no evidence of anything strong or anything that was
Okay.
worth really worrying about. It basically, if they set up a tower somewhere and the intensity is too strong and it burns your skin, you'll know because your skin is burned, and you'll know very quickly that this is what caused it, and you'll be able to figure it out. But if for intensities that are lower than an effect that you could detect, then probably there's no effect
Okay.
that can be detected easily.
So
So
what you
I tend to think that there's not a lot of merit in that work, and I know that a lot of people are going to be very upset with me saying that.
well
It's a very hot, uh, uh, sensitive point with a lot of people. It's
sure, okay, but Prof, what you're saying is
yeah.
then I need to phone up David Icke, who's been on my show a couple times, and say, listen, David, you're a bit off on this one.
Well, Jeremy, you have to convince yourself about whether or not I'm off, or one has to look at the evidence. One has to go and look at the evidence. How can you tell?
We have one
You know,
last question. Can I read you one
okay.
last question? All right. Ask the Prof about his views on basically excessive sanitizing.
Well, one of the things I wrote in my last paper that was published at Panda is that it is now quite certain, determined, that propagation does not occur through contact, meaning touching and surfaces and fomites. It's none of that contributes to transmission of viral respiratory diseases or of SARS. Okay, there's a big review that came out recently. I reviewed the review, and it's very conclusive. It cites all of the article, everything that's known about that, and it was very convincing to me to look at that again. And I've always thought that it has to be aerosols because we know the seasonal cycle and we know the mechanism of it and so on. So it's not, I'm having a really hard time trying to figure out why the World Health Organization said at the beginning that fomites were probably important. I just do not understand how, when faced with a viral respiratory disease, they could have come up with that. It's wrong, I think. And so that means that washing your hands and washing surfaces is completely paranoid, unscientific, and useless with regards to propagation of a viral respiratory disease. That's what it means. Now, I have to note, Raoult, who is this brilliant man that you just mentioned, he believes, I'm told, I didn't read his actual paper or anything, but he believes that transmission is mainly through contact and fomites. So we're at odds on that point. I'm reviewing the scientific literature. Everything I know, I can only make sense of this if this is transmitted by aerosol particles in air. He has said, and I know that his followers, if you like, the people that really appreciate his work, have questioned me on this. But all I'm doing is reporting what I've read in the scientific literature and what makes sense to me in terms of how I understand the epidemiology of these diseases. But that is a point that we differ on.
But I mean, by and large, it seems counterintuitive to constantly wash your hands. You know, when I was growing up, Prof, my parents always said to me, go and play outside in the garden, get dirty, play in the mud.
Yeah, well, that's scientifically a serious proposal, that our exposure to microbes and pathogens and all the biota that are out there is part of what makes us healthy as we are growing up, because our immune systems have to learn about all these things that are out in the world. And so that's a very serious scientific position. That's just not something, it's not just something that your mother or grandmother would say. But pure and simple, there is no, every time that people have said, oh, the transmission was probably by contact, when they actually looked at the study, they hadn't controlled for aerosol transmission. And it made more sense that it would be aerosol transmission. You cannot explain super spreaders and hotspots of transmission with contact, because these are not places where everybody goes and touches everyone's nose and eyes and everything. And that's not what it's about. It's about breathing the same air for a while. Okay, that's why you get this. And in fact, and this is interesting, Jeremy, in 2019, the World Health Organization put out a big report about how to handle the next pandemic of a viral respiratory disease. In 2019, they put out a big report. Okay, 2019, and they said in there They made recommendations, and they said in there the things that you should never do under any circumstances. And one of them was
I saw that.
it makes no sense to do contact tracing, for example, because
Mm.
it's not relevant. It's just going to mix you up, and you just don't do that. You don't spend resources doing that. That's one of the recommendations they made, because
They were also opposed to isolating people.
yes, isolating healthy people. You don't do lockdowns, and you only you own and yeah, there are a bunch of recommendations there that are exactly contradicted in what they then recommended a year later. And this was like the summation of all knowledge that we have and the best advice we can give moving forward, right? This is their mega report in 2019. I mean, this is the level of absurdity that we're at. Um, Another thing they did, the World Health Organization did, was to write a big report in 2009, I think it was, or 2006, where they emphasized, having reviewed the literature, the importance of ventilation to prevent in built spaces the propagation of these diseases,
Mm.
and how many liters per second you had to if you had nothing else was good, and all these kinds of things, right? That report was buried by them. You cannot find it. If you want to find that report, and I found it and I talk about it in my articles, you have to go into water quality and toxicity of water sources to find the report about ventilation in regards to aerosol particles, okay? That's how crazy this thing is.
Apologies for the little glitch there. I pushed the wrong button.
No problem.
I really would love to chat to you for longer, but I've had you for a long time now, and it is quite late here. I've gone through a number of the questions. Well, I've gone through a few of them. There are too many to cover, Prof, but I think you've covered the gist of, well, pretty much everything. In a really bite-sized kind of way. But if I could give you a moment or two to leave my viewers with a very pertinent thought, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say this. I personally have become convinced through my reading, my thought, my analysis, my discussions with other scientists and so on. I've become convinced that if they had not made this fuss, if there had not been the propaganda campaign and everything that was tied to it, and if there had not been the government responses, then we would not have noticed any unusual deaths beyond the usual mortality that is seasonal in our societies. We just wouldn't have noticed anything. I've become convinced of that. So in that sense, it has been a fabrication. It has been a terrible lie.
Political blunder.
Well, I think it was not a blunder. It was a campaign. I think they intend to do this. There's a lot of money involved, but there's more than money involved. And now this would open up a whole other topic, which is the geopolitical side. I don't know if you want me to say a few words about that.
Please go ahead.
Well, okay. The thing that is most threatening to the global elite that still control many things in the Western world, the thing that's most threatening to them is people, and especially the middle and working class. I mean, the professional classes are completely indoctrinated and bought out and everything. They're not a threat. But you've got all these other people in the middle class that are a real threat, because if they start talking among themselves and decide who to elect, and actually elect people that represent them and do things like that, it becomes very dangerous for them. We live in a very crazy world where the actual bosses are invisible. The people who tell our politicians what's a smart thing to say these days, and which pandemic we should worry about, and how your finances should be run nationally and so on, the people who run the place, we don't know what their structure is. We don't know who they are exactly. We don't know what their mechanisms are, what the controls are. We don't know anything. And so they're vulnerable, because sooner or later people are going to want to know who these people are and how they operate, and they're going to want to enforce transparency and accountability sooner or later, because it's become so obvious that we're
Mm.
run by this global cabal, you know? And so they are vulnerable, and the way they can defend themselves against people who might become political and might organize and might start having ideas and learning things on their own and so on, the way they can defend against that, one way, is to have complete surveillance and complete control of the internet environment, and to isolate them so they're not meeting, so they're not talking, so they can't easily organize into political parties and so on. And when they do, you know everything about them because they're doing it on Zoom, and they're doing
Mm.
it by communication methods that you can peer into whenever you want. And also, very important, you have to be able to shut off that they can travel. Especially, you don't want mixing to jurisdictions. You don't want a lot of people going to jurisdictions where they're not able to surveil you. Someone else is surveilling
Yeah.
you. If you go to China,
Yeah.
go and live in China for a while, and all of a sudden the people that do surveillance for the Western globalists don't see what you're doing, who you're talking to, what you might be saying, how you're organizing things, and then you travel back with that knowledge or whatever, you know. And
And
so they don't want travel, they don't want freedom, they don't want um, things that the government, you know, in broad sense, doesn't know about,
mm.
can't control, because um, we're a great danger to them if we decide to have some democracy and some transparency and some accountability. That would be dangerous. So I think they're deadly afraid of that.
And I
And
mean,
one of the reasons, yeah,
no,
yeah,
I mean, and I was going to add to that. You mentioned democracy, and I was going to, put on my tinfoil hat for a second there and say that, maybe, swing an election that favors China. Oh, did I say that out loud?
an election that favors China. Well, that might favor um, having economic ties with China, right? Because they're competing groups within the West, and some people have decided that they need to cut China off, because the biggest way to handle this competitor is to cut them off and to solidify what we already have,
Mm.
and the continents that we exploit already. Versus there was still a belief in the global elite that you could take China through investment and through influence through capitalism.
Mm.
That has failed. That has failed because the communist government is too well organized and has
Yeah.
maintained sovereignty on China. So there are these big debates happening as to how to do this.
Mm.
And so, yeah, political changes can change how we see China and how we cooperate or not in the world with what some would see as competitors, others see as something to take over, others see as, you see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah, all this matters.
But, Prof, it has been the greatest of pleasure chatting to you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I know that just about every single person who's been watching is a fan. Someone in the comments actually interacts with you on Twitter. His name is Jason, and he actually put me onto you. I don't know him personally, but he put me onto you, and I am so glad that he did, because I think the world would be a much emptier place without thinkers like yourself, and dare I say scientists like yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm as glad to be here, and I'm glad to meet your listeners and so on in this way. It's been great.
Hopefully you'll be back.
Sure. If something comes up where I am a voice that needs to be heard on a particular thing, I'd be happy to come back.
Fantastic. Denis, Prof. Denis, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful day further. And I'll catch you on the internet. By the way, I'll chat you via email, because someone asked me for a few links to documents that you've written and stuff, and I'll get those from you and add into my website.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy.
My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the Battle of Ideas.